in your posts, we see the line being drawn. That's ultimately my issue with the content that you've posted.
But my philosophy goes past that. It goes beyond that. It might have been my twin brother that said these things, though. Deep fake. People are probably like, what, you kidding me? You actually believe that? I do believe that. I 100% stand by those words.
There is no solid foundation of good biomechanics that can come from repetitions of ATG squats. Can I make that assumption?
Definitely.
Okay. So then I would say then we can agree to disagree there. Like seriously, genuinely.
Yeah. We all believe that our approach is best.
At this point, I would like to press you just a little bit more here. I have one more example, and you say deep HEG squats are responsible for more injuries than any other training method or exercise in existence.
This is like kind of traumatic on the body if people are doing this type of training, and we show the injury rate prevalence is this high once we reclassify what an injury is.
But Joel, you immediately equated what I asked you to Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting,
right.
And that's not what I'm talking about. You're bridging that gap. That's what you're doing in your mind. You're the one bridging that gap. You're calling ATG squatting the most injurious thing. Today's video is sponsored by Barbell Apparel. Go to barbellapparel.com/Zach Tellender, and there you can get all of my t-shirts. And there's also my favorite pieces of clothing from Barbell Apparel, just an amazing apparel company for training and for leisure. We finally got the original No Excuses, Just Improve t-shirts restocked. So get in there and get one before they sell out again. And then we also have my newest shirt, which is probably my favorite shirt, and that is the metal t-shirt. So anyways, go to barbellapparel.com/Zach Tellender and get you one. So Joel, just before we move on, I competed in weightlifting. I coached weightlifting for almost a decade now, but it stemmed from strength and conditioning. So
right.
I was an intern at Northwestern University, then a paid intern at Texas A&M University, got my CSCS, got a bunch of certifications, obviously the USAW level 2, CrossFit level 2, a couple of personal training, whatever, the certifications that people just end up letting expire, like myself. But it does stem from, like, I do see things from a lens of these are an athlete for their sport. And I'd say the most recent athletes that I trained for like a good portion of time was grapplers, and like world-class grapplers. And then also some of the guys are doing MMA a little bit. His name's Cody Steele. I don't train them anymore, but for 2 years I was able to work directly with those guys. And so like, I do have the viewpoint of an Olympic weightlifter, but I just want you to know that like there is a strength and conditioning aspect to my knowledge as well. Nice. And I'm not just biased by that. I think people are going to, and I just want to lay that out there for you because I know that you don't know that before we move on, if that makes sense.
Well, all right. So I think the question that I have for sport in general and training in relation to sport, and I work with some pretty significant athletes as well. Not going to like mention names, but folks that are at the highest level. And so it's a really interesting question for me of what is the appropriate amount of stimulus from a weight room and what are the appropriate ranges of motion that are necessary. And I think the ultimate question, I think it's almost like maybe it's a purely mechanical, objective, scientific, reductionist, absolute answer exists in here somewhere, but it seems like there's nuance and probably a lot of variables in the question. But what's the most effective style of training in the weight room that transfers the best over to the field or the ice for an athlete? Can you explain like your perspective on that?
Yep. So one of the things that I always try to differentiate as much as I can is sports performance, and then the other kind of side category of Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting in their own separate category as their own unique entity, if you will, because obviously for those competitions and for those endeavors, you need to be able to get into deep positions and you need to be able to, basically lift heavy in those positions. And so I always say the 90-degree principle applies predominantly to other athletes in other sports that don't involve, being judged when it comes to lifting weights. So now, with that said, I don't agree that, or I don't say that powerlifters and Olympic lifters would not benefit from 90 degrees. I actually do believe they would benefit greatly from including a good amount of 90-degree training in their protocol, simply because I believe, and again, there's science to substantiate this, that with 90-degree joint angles, you do optimize not just your biomechanical leverage and anatomical levers, but also motor unit recruitment. You also maximize the element of co-contraction between agonist and antagonist muscles, which is really important for joint stability on and off the field. But particularly when we're talking about, non-contact injuries, which is becoming more and more prevalent in sports. And so, that's what I try to do with my athletes. I try to say, hey, how are we going to most closely mimic what's happening on the field? Now, obviously, athletes are going to end up in bad positions. It's not like, you're only playing this sport to 90 degrees and that's it. That's not practical. And in fact, every one of the athletes that I train, I can guarantee you every time they go onto the playing field, they're getting into positions periodically that are not always 90 degrees. I'm sure they're getting into extreme positions here and there. So that's going to happen. But when we look at kind of like what's optimal biomechanics for sprinting, for hitting, for throwing, for running, we can see from the science that 90 degrees is biomechanically optimal for most positions. And the nervous system is very pliable. So what I like to do is say, hey, how we train is going to transfer to the field. And I think most strength coaches would agree with that. So if we train to optimize the biomechanics and the nervous system to operate on those 90-degree positions, it's more likely that we're going to end up in those optimal biomechanical states when we're on the playing field, and therefore we're going to be producing more force and having a reduced chance of injury. But like I said, I also understand that it's going to happen periodically. Every time someone goes in the field, that they're going to be in compromised positions. But I already spoke a lot there. Let me hand that over to you guys a little bit.
So, what do you think on that?
Yeah, so you first brought up Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting, and I understand that. Is your position that like really those ranges of motions, like that's a separate thing? Like you guys can squat below 90, you can bench below 90, or sorry, above 90. I don't know.
It's how because full biomechanics.
Right. Full range in powerlifting, full range in Olympic lifting. That's totally fine. But you were saying sport specific, like you shouldn't do that.
I don't recommend it under heavy loads.
Okay.
Do you have to define, can you define heavy load? Because this is where it gets, from my perspective, into nuance and specificity of well, who is the person? What is a heavy load? Is there some people that could do maybe a light load? At what point does that subjective concept of heavy load become heavy load?
I don't really do any loaded exercises beyond 90 degrees. Okay. Now I can explain that a little bit more in a second here. But if I have other strength coaches that say, hey, Joel, I like your 90-degree centric isometrics method, but I also like including, some large range of motion or some end range, how do you feel about that? I'm like, hey, whatever's working for you, as long as you've done the research and as long as you've kind of understood the methods and aren't just blindly implementing them, and you understand what you're doing with that. But I'd always say, hey, I just don't recommend doing heavy loads under those larger positions. I never say, hey, I still wouldn't do that. Now I say, hey, this is maybe what I do. I don't necessarily train any loaded positions under 90, but as long as you don't go heavy past 90, you'll probably be all right. Personally, I think it creates a little bit of a neuromuscular / neurological confusion, where if I want the athlete to end up in the best positions in their sport and to have the best biomechanics, that you're kind of confusing the nervous system and you're reinforcing what I would consider to be less than optimal motor programs in their central nervous system. So that's why I don't do it. Now I used to, okay? And this has been kind of my journey on the whole 90-degree thing, is that I actually come from a background where I squatted ass to grass and taught ass to grass. And then I started to see a little bit more value in changing some of the range of motion, but I still included large range because it's like, hey, I still want that mobility and whatnot. And over the years, I would say I've become a little bit more, again, if you want to call it absolute, not because I've just become more stubborn and stuck in my ways, but just because of what I've seen works best with my athletes. So
the issue that I found as a strength and conditioning coach is consistently it's a loading problem. So like most of what we do is loading. If somebody thinks that a deadlift is bad for them, or a full range deadlift or whatever is bad for them, well, what does that mean? If I put a 20-kilo barbell in your hand, are you going to be able to hinge at the hips and deadlift it? Well, the answer is yes. The next answer would be, well, in 4 weeks, it's likely that I could get you to do 100 pounds. And then in 8 weeks, it's likely that I could get you to do, X amount of pounds. And so when the way that I see loading and heavy load and load is that it's all subjective to the person's training. So it's really hard to then say, hey, ass to grass squats are bad for you at heavy loads, because heavy loads is not a direct line. But there's one part, Joel, that I think that I mainly kind of disagree with you in, is that it's that kind of using specificity as this idea that you can continuously defend your point using specificity, because it's really hard to know then at what line we should do things in the weight room, because the weight room isn't specific. If we wanted to be specific with basketball players, we'd have them shoot weighted basketballs. We attach bands to their hips and have them jump around, which people do. But the reason why we have people in the weight room is to get general physical preparedness. And so if we look at general physical preparedness, well, it's not specific to the game. It's not. And then you as a coach have to determine where and when you implement non-specific things to specific training. So to say that ass to grass squatting is never viable ever, well, then what comes with that is a lot of other things are not viable, or they have to be, or they should be. It's what happens is, Joel, is like you kind of lay out this line, and then now we can ask questions and determine all of the things underneath that line. Like, hey, is this wrong? Is this wrong? Is this wrong? And you go, well, maybe not, maybe not. And my thing is, if you never put the line there will never be the issue. And that's where, like, continuously in your verbiage, in your posts, we see the line being drawn. And that's ultimately my issue with the content that you've posted over the years.
But my philosophy goes past that. It goes beyond that, because actually the way I train most of my athletes, whether it's a golfer, a baseball player, a football player, general population, 70-year-old, it's actually pretty similar. Okay. I actually focus and stick to squatting, hinging, lunging, horizontal push and pull, vertical push and pull with 90 degrees. And I have a golfer right now, a PGA golfer. I don't know if I posted a few things. So I don't know if I'm not going to give his name out, but if people want to go to my page, I haven't got his permission. I can give his name, but I just trained him today, and we were discussing, and he understands this. Like, I'm not training him like a golfer. I'm training him to get his body moving correctly. And I believe that the 90-degree positions are not just the most optimal in terms of recruiting highest number of motor units, creating those co-contraction positions when we need them to stabilize joints, but it's also the healthiest on the tissues. It minimizes how much we have to recover and how much we kind of beat the body up. It minimizes tension to the joints and the connective tissue. And as a result, we've been training for like 3 weeks now, and he already says, hey, I feel better. I feel like I can rotate and move better. We haven't touched rotational training. I don't know how much rotational training I'm even going to touch them, because he does so much rotation to begin with. So I'm not trying to, like, oh man, he's a golfer, I'm going to train him totally different. I just go back to the foundational movements, and nothing fancy yet. Eventually we'll get to a few cool stabilization, probably hanging band exercises, which I'm a fan of, and some offset work, because I believe there's some good and important neurological things that it creates in the nervous system. But it's pretty basic. If people come and watch me and they shadow me, they see it's like, man, it's pretty simple. You train a lot of guys the same way, regardless of their goals, and they get that because they feel the benefits of that. So I don't want to make it sound like, oh man, this is how they end up in the field, so I'm going to train them exactly like this. It's
no, and I don't think you're doing just that. It's just when you use specificity as the reason for why we don't do deep squats. So right. That's where it's like, okay, well, hold on, because the specificity thing is a weird one, right? Like we do
Right. That
GPP,
is.
like Verkhoshansky and all of the Russians back in the 60s and 70s, like they're like, hey, we can train people not specific to their sport. Because if like what they used to do is just be like, oh, you're a javelin thrower, just go throw the javelin. Maybe throw like a heavier one, maybe do some different drills. But now we realize like we can do things to help you be more explosive of a human. But we all know these things. And now we know that like we don't have to train our athletes completely specific. And I know you know that as well. But what, even in your response just now, you're like, this I feel is the healthiest and most optimal. It's most optimal, healthiest, most optimal. Those are both superlatives. Those are both absolutes. And I think, again, that's fine from a strength and conditioning coach because we all have our biases from what works. Like this has worked for me. Has worked. It's just that, again, the way that you formulate some of your posts, it seems as though it's not really, it doesn't bring that nuance that I would like. I have some posts here of yours. If you are comfortable, if I could bring them up and then
totally.
Okay. So this one's actually from a long time ago.
It might have been my twin brother that said these things though.
Who's your twin, Joe? Joe Seedman?
That's exactly right.
Okay, so this one's from 4 years ago, Joel. Okay.
Yeah.
This one says stop squatting ATG. Let's see here. If your training goals are decreased strength, increased joint pain, degradations to natural body mechanics, herniated discs, sciatic issues, chronic low back pain, blown knees, foot and ankle aberrations, decreased jump performance, degraded gait mechanics, constant muscle tightness, and the need to continually perform foam rolling, stretching, soft tissue work, cupping, dry needling, and other therapeutic modalities to eliminate the associated pain, then keep squatting ATG.
That's
However,
bold.
If your goal is to
deep fake.
If your goal is improvements in size, strength, performance, power, body mechanics, muscle function, posture, proprioception, balance, stability, and mobility, as well as decreased joint pain and muscle tightness, then you'll want to squat between 90 degrees, 10 to 20 degree above parallel, and parallel, slightly below a 90-degree joint angle. Remember, it all comes down to training goals and objectives. So that statement right there doesn't really bring much nuance at all. Like you're presenting one option, saying you can do this, and then saying how bad it is. Yeah. So Joel, I would just love to hear your thoughts on that post. Do you remember that post or?
I must have been drunk. I don't remember. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, 100%. I remember that. Okay, that's probably the most honest and open I've been about my like overall feeling. And again, people are probably like, "What? You kidding me? You actually believe that?" I do believe that. Most of the time, I'm not that. Yes, most of the time, I'm not that honest and upfront and bold because I know most of the time, people can't handle that. And I saw at that post, people couldn't handle it quite as much as I was hoping they would. And I knew it was going to spark some controversy. I didn't think it was going to be that confrontational because to me, hey, everyone's got an opinion. So it's like, yeah, you believe that. I don't believe it, but so on, do your own thing. So that was, I 100% stand by those words. Am I being a little melodramatic for the sake of kind of like, presenting it to get people's attention? Possibly, but I've seen all those things occur in my own body as well as my own athletes. Now, the key is that it doesn't happen immediately because it's like somebody says, hey man, I'm squatting deep. I didn't blow my knees out. Well, I can go show you a deep squat right now and I won't blow my knees out either. But it's over time. And I always say poor body mechanics, okay? It's like smoking. It might take weeks, it might take months, it might take years. For some folks who genetically are blessed, whatever, it may take decades, but eventually smoking catches up to everyone, just like poor body mechanics catch up to everyone. I've worked with enough athletes who've been training for years and decades that when they have a what I would consider some form of muscle dysfunction, I'm not gonna go into whether I would say the 90 thing is dysfunctional right now, but it's my feeling and belief and my again, the science, in my opinion, when I look at that and from comparing that to what I see on the field, that when we train with poor body mechanics, okay, it transfers to the field. And so when I see someone squat ass to grass, Go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry. So you mentioned poor body mechanics, but like,
All right.
what if it's not poor?
Yeah, that's the nuance part.
I would consider a loaded ass to grass squat poor body mechanics for most sports because that's not weightlifting and powerlifting.
Okay. Well, so that doesn't count. I don't want to even. Those aren't even in
Yeah.
my realm of
Right.
like so with my grapplers, we would squat below parallel, and we would actually relatively light. And the most we'd ever do was like body weight, and I wouldn't let their knees collapse, and I wouldn't let them do a lot of things. This is me. I'm a coach. I'm watching you. Hey, if they do a shitty rep, I go, hey, that was shit. That's what a coach is supposed to do. I don't eliminate the movement entirely. But Joel, this is an important thing because we can kind of move on from here. If you believe that there is no way that movement can be proper, then we can actually genuinely disagree and move on from this point.
It becomes very circular, kind of like biblical conversation.
Yeah. No, this is like you said, this is kind of like, we're picking at one point, but it's also kind of the central point of this entire argument. So it's like we figure this out and you kind of show everything. So I think this is important. There is one other thing that I didn't mention. I've mentioned it before in post. I do believe an ass to grass body weight squat is perfectly healthy. I have no issues with that for anyone and everyone who can do it pain-free. Okay, because there are some people just structurally who that's not in their wheelhouse for whatever reason anatomically.
The air squat or body weight squat is actually a loaded squat, and here's why.
Right.
Like if we talk about metabolites in the muscle forming after 20 reps of an air squat, all of a sudden the mechanical load on your joints and your tissues is actually higher than if you just did one single rep. So, you can have bad biomechanics on your 21st rep, whereas your first rep is good. And the reason why this is important is because there is still a load variable between person to person, between rep to rep, between set to set. So again, if your rule is that, okay, we only are allowed to do body weight squats below parallel, well, that still is subjective. And somebody who weighs 285 pounds is going to have much more load on their joints and their, all of their systems are going to have much more load than somebody who's 150 pounds.
This goes back to what I was saying earlier. I don't consider a heavy force production 90-degree squat, like a squat we would use for jumping. Okay. I don't consider that and a body weight or an ass to grass squat the same motor programs. I feel like they, and I do believe they are two very different and distinct motor programs that it's not like they're going to really interfere with each other because again, it goes back to that spinal flexion thing. It's not like we're trying, I don't coach people to keep that spine super neutral and arched when they get into that deep position. If they did, it's like, okay, this is starting to get closer to the positions you might want to like jump out of. You're getting your body braced. So I use the ass to grass squat in theory and philosophy as like, hey, this is just more of a chilling position. This is not a position I'm going to have you producing lots of force and doing lots of concentric, eccentric cycles of movement. If you want to hang out there for a few minutes and just chill, totally fine. But we're not going to do sets and reps of that. So that's not something I ever do with my athletes. It's like, hey, if you want to get into a squat position, just kind of hold that and just kind of relax like people would in third world country squat, go for it.
Is there a certain body mass index of a person that suddenly you would not advise a deep squat with because suddenly they're loaded too much? If I'm a 350-pound lineman in the NFL, am I too loaded for that to be an advantageous position to create, specific adaptation and post demand, like to create some more robusticity around my knees and my ankles and get some expansion contraction muscles around my pelvic floor and kind of support some of that circulation of all those fluids through that just natural compression that would manifest as a product of going through that range of motion. If I'm 350 pounds, is that too heavy? What if I lose 50 pounds? What if I was 200 pounds? Then I went on a 6-month bender and I gained 100 pounds. Is it suddenly not safe for that position anymore? What if I wear a weight vest? It's like now it's almost like it's my body weight. What if I wear a 100-pound weight vest? What if I'm maintaining perfect joint mechanics, perfect joint centration, all the way from, toes all the way up to my fingertips, and pressure dynamics, like everything is really like just brick shit house strong. I just, for me, it would be really hard to move me away from the perspective that there's a lot of nuance.
I would just like to kind of fundamentally grab what you're all about, Joel. It seems as though there is no solid foundation of good biomechanics that can come from repetitions of ATG squats. Is that a correct assumption to make? Can I make
Yes,
that assumption?
Definitely.
Okay. So then I would say then we can agree to disagree there. Like seriously, genuinely.
Yeah. We all believe that our approach is best. Otherwise, if it wasn't, I would be using somebody else's approach. If I believed Mark Bell's approach was the best, I would be exclusively using. So everybody thinks that because everyone's their own strength coach. Everyone has their own method. Nobody is 100% of the time copying another strength coach's method verbatim perfectly. They're always taking a mix and match. So again, if I believe my way is the best way, okay, then there's like scales under that where I would say, doing tons of heavy, extreme loaded ass to grass, deep range of motion, consistently with heavy loads, hey, that's going to be problematic. And we can kind of work our way up until there's less issues. So we agree to disagree, but at the same time, I don't think what you're doing is going to be very problematic. I think it's a smarter approach.
So fundamentally, this is what my channel has been about. So weightlifting in the sports performance world has been under attack by just numbers of coaches. And it's usually the same argument over and over again. Why would I do a power clean when I can do a loaded jump or something that gets triple extension the way that these things happen? I believe that fundamentally the issue is actually within that coach and the self-awareness of the coach. What I feel happens a lot is the coach may not have a big background in Olympic weightlifting or teaching the Olympic lifts to a group of athletes. And they might see a frustration in this. And they might say, hey, I can get a lot of really good stuff out of the things that I implement. And I see great results. So what I'm going to do is write a blog post. That's how it started. Whether it was Elite FTS back in the day, whether it was T Nation, they write this op-ed about how shitty the Olympic lifts are for X, Y, and Z. And continuously what I say is, it's not the movement that is inherently bad or inherently suboptimal. It's just the coach's way of implementing it. And that is totally okay. I would say that I cannot implement these things as well as you can implement the things that you implement, Joel, unless I go to you and study under you for like a year or 2 years. And then I could be like, okay, now I'm going to implement it. But because I can't do that, because I'm not doing that, I am not going to implement Joel Seedman's stuff. And I think that you would say that's okay, right? That's a totally fine and acceptable thing. But what I don't want to do is say, hey, your shit is garbage. And there's one last example before I kind of send it over to you.
Yeah.
A big one of these was Robert Oberst on Rogan. And this video got 7 million views or something like that. I don't know. It's way in the millions. And he just said, you should not do deadlifts, period. Unless you're getting paid or you're trying to be strong or trying to be a power lifter, you should not do deadlifts. It will injure you. To me, that is such an unacceptable, irresponsible thing to say to the population for a number of reasons. And it's that exact type of thing that proliferates. And sadly, Joel, that's what I see in some of your posts. And maybe you don't mean that, but that is genuinely the issue that I have.
Sometimes it comes down to the mood too. Like the post from 4 years ago, I don't know. I just like, hey, I'm just going to let it all out. Like, hey, this is what I believe 100% and take it or leave it. Other times I'm going to post and it's like, hey, I'm going to have a little less controversy in this one, maybe a little bit more subtle, kind of like, hey, here's some of the principles I use, but maybe these other approaches are okay. So, I mean, again, I would say, yes, I agree that my views and philosophies are pretty absolute and pretty dogmatic, but at the same time, I value and appreciate what other coaches such as yourself are doing. So it's not like oh man, what you're doing is horrible. Again, it's on a scale. So again, if I want to put mine at like a 9 and yours is maybe like, I don't know, 7, that again, I'm just from my own psychological mind of how I would view that. Whereas if I viewed someone, like I saw somebody the other day, somebody sent me a post it was this guy's account, and everything they were doing was like spastic movements. Like everything had to be rapid. Like even just picking the weight up off the floor, like it just had to be like super spastic, because if movement, every movement has to be quick, every movement has to be fast, because we move fast as athletes. And you looked at the quality of movement, I was like, man, this is like, I would never say this on social media, I would never mention his name, but like on a scale of 1 to 10, I would put the quality of movement at like a 2.
So Joel, you naturally spectrumed out what you believe is the best and what you believe is the worst. You created this spectrum, and then within that spectrum, depending on the person, it can change. And that's the sort of nuance that every single strength and conditioning coach has, and every successful one has. And I feel as though like I personally would love if you could do that in one of your posts. But the problem is I feel as though it's going to be hard to sell your program and your methodology if you do that. And I understand that. You have to make money. You have to it's about your thing and what you do. At this point, I would like to press you just a little bit more here. I have one more example, and then I have an exciting proposition for you. Okay. So I have one more post that you have recently. In this post, you have an NFL player who's doing 90-degree eccentric isometric. And you're speaking over the top of it, and you say deep HEG squats are responsible for more injuries than any other training method or exercise in existence. In contrast, 90-degree eccentric isometrics are the single most therapeutic modality, never contributing to any injury, but healing instead. So when I hear that, that is incredibly absolute, saying the most injurious of any methodology, and then that 90-degree squatting is the most healing of any methodology. If you could kind of explain that maybe in a little bit more depth, or what your thoughts were with that.
Yeah. So again, I do believe that that's one of those, posters like, hey, I'm letting it all out. Like this is how I feel. But actually, so if you look at the research of Olympic weightlifting, and this has been a kind of a known thing for quite a few, I guess say decades now, because when I did my USAW certification back in the day, which is getting close to like 16 years now, we talked about how the sport of Olympic weightlifting has a very low rate of injury, right? I mean, it just does, right? When you actually look at the statistics of what's been shown, and the same thing with powerlifting. Like if you compare it to other sports, it's not all that different. It's pretty similar. It might be like either a tad higher or a tad lower, but it relatively statistically similar for all intents and purposes. There was a recent, and it's maybe 1 or 2 studies, but they went back and reclassified the criteria that was going to be used to be categorizing injuries and what actually happened. Because as you know, weightlifters, powerlifters, they're pretty strong mentally and physically. If they're beat up and feeling sore and they're injured, they're going to try to train through it, right? I mean, it's just how it is. So they went back and reclassified what constituted as an injury. And they were very surprised to see this. This is actually in one of my articles online. Again, I try and put a ton of stuff online so people don't have to buy my programs unless they absolutely want to, but that's a different topic.
Do you know what the name is of this by chance?
It's like towards the end of my squat.
Okay.
I don't want to, yeah. It's the end of if you go towards the end of my squat 101 article, you'll see I think it's like the points 80 something to 101. It talks about like the truth about Olympic weightlifting, powerlifting studies, all that. Okay. Because I wanted to look at that more, because it's like, man, okay, so if Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting are not responsible for as many injuries as I thought, because it's like, all right, well then, but so they reclassified this notion of what constitutes an injury. When they did that, when they made it a little bit more strict, the rate of injury and the injury prevalence in powerlifting and weightlifting went through the roof. And I believe it was the squat, I'm almost positive because I had this in the article, was responsible for more injuries than deadlifts and bench press. And it was a pretty high number. So, and again, it doesn't mean that like, oh my gosh, they were incapacitated to the point where they were in the ER, they had to go to the doctor and they were bedridden. It's like, no, but they were feeling significant pain. They had to really alter their training methods because they were experiencing pain. And again, if we look at the research on inflammation and how muscles work, when you have any type of musculoskeletal inflammation like that, okay, that's long lasting, that literally accelerates the aging process. So it's like, man, this is like kind of traumatic on the body if people are doing this type of training, and we show the injury rate and prevalence is this high once we reclassify what an injury is.
But Joel, you immediately equated what I asked you to Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting,
Right.
and that's not what I'm talking about.
So you have these categories of Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting. Those are the most extreme on that scale of like, wow, these are ultra loaded. And I think this was powerlifting they were looking at. It was either both or one or the other. But if you look at how a lot of strength coaches use ass to grass squats, how it's been used in the past and how it's still used, not all, because I mentioned the way you're using it to me is a much more intelligent approach. Okay, again, I wouldn't do it, but it's much more intelligent in my opinion. But the way you have a lot of these kids in high school and college, I see it daily. It's like, man, these new guys come in who have been in college and they're doing deep ass to grass squats with 500 pounds. It's like, okay, well, maybe they're not professional Olympic weightlifters and powerlifters, but for all intents and purposes, the amount of load that they're getting under these positions, it's like, man, this is pretty extreme. And powerlifters and go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. But don't you see how you're bridging that gap? Like that's what you're doing in your mind. You're the one bridging that gap, saying the moment we like you're calling ATG squatting the most injurious thing, the most injurious methodology. And you're bridging that gap to then saying that Olympic weightlifters, they may or may not get I need to check this study out. They may or may not get the most injuries of most sports, and they increase the aging process, all of these things. And then you're bridging that gap to saying the strength coaches that you see are doing that, which may be true. But again, none of that is kind of founded in sort of this science. It's all kind of this feeling. But then the sentence that you produce is that it's the most injurious. I'm not sure that that's the most fair way of producing that.
So something in defense of the perspective of the concept of most, which doesn't really sound that absolute. All to me is absolute. Most actually seems like that's in the realm of conversations. Like that could be reasonable. That seems like,
but there probably
that
is 51%, right, Aaron?
Yeah,
that means
so
51% or more.
Exactly. So right. So but there probably is
how do we
statistically know that? some training modality or specific exercise, if there was some way to quantify it, that is the most injurious in all of athletic training or all of weightlifting. And so I'd be curious to like turn that around to you, Zach. If you had a gun to your head, which obviously you don't, and nobody really does, but if you had to take a stab at what is the most injurious exercise in strength and conditioning,
it's hard to kind of put something like I couldn't put a singular movement in that category, because to have something be the most injurious, that would envelop all loading, all sets and reps, all tempos, all eccentrics, all isometrics, all pauses into one singular movement, and then calling it and saying, this is injurious. I just simply cannot do that. Even the Instagram videos of the football players who are back squatting 500 pounds, like we don't know what the training was before that. And we don't know what the training was after that. Now, if we are to assume that it's very similar to a power lifter, then actually, Joel, I would 100% agree with you that is idiotic. Maybe in some really off-season block where they're trying to get big and jacked and then they can just taper off and never hit those weights again, maybe that's okay. But I would agree with you, Joel. The problem, though, is the verbiage that you use to kind of then say that ATG squatting is the most injurious. It's that bridging of that gap that, for me, it's just a no-go. It's just I can't do that.
I work with a lot of college, pro, high school athletes, and I'm always, hey, what do you guys do for your training? I always inquire about that. And essentially, if the strength coach believes in ass to grass squats, they are doing heavy loaded ass to grass squats. It's not like, oh, some of them do a little smarter. It's like literally when I say probably 100% of it, and I'm talking dozens of high school kids or dozens of high schools that have dealt with in kids, colleges. It's almost like it would be great if a lot of strength coaches were doing it as intelligent as you are in terms of kind of differentiating between, hey, we're going to go heavy and loaded under these conditions, and we're going to go maybe a lot lighter and a little bit more systematic under these deep ass to grass positions. Unfortunately, in a perfect world, that would be great, but I don't see that, and it's just something that I wish strength coaches would get those nuances, but they don't. So I'm kind of like speaking to
I hear you.
the broad audience of that.
There's another guy. He used to be the Australian rugby strength coach. Or used to be. He had a bunch of different names. Now he's not even in the strength and conditioning field anymore. But he would make a lot of memes on these football coaches. Football strength and conditioning coaches. And he would have the exact same approach that you would, Joel. The thing is, though, he's not the biggest fan of you. And the reason
what's his name?
His name is Kerr.
Rugby. Kerr.
Kerr Wenham Flat. He's one of my friends, and he's not the biggest fan of you, even though he's fighting the same fight you are. So this is where it's like, ultimately, we, like many of these debates are going to end up is like, yes, we agree. There is a major flaw with the way that sports performance is taught on these like mass scale. But having said that, there's a lot of really cool stuff. I've seen some really cool and smart individuals in this. And I can actually, I can send you some Instagrams of like some really great football strength coaches. They squat their guys. They squat them to slightly below parallel. Maybe it's hard to determine what ass to grass is. Again, we brought this up before. Is ass to grass 140 degree, but they do squat them, and they're smart about recovery, and they're smart about planning. They're smart about the macro cycle. So there's goodness in there. I'm not sure that the fight against the badness is the absolute statements. And again, inherently, I think you and I are going to disagree on that. This is you with no filter, just saying what you're saying.
Those are fair points too. And again, I know strength coaches in this industry who do things a little bit differently than me, and I learn from them. So when people are like, man, you got to keep an open, like I'm always trying to keep an open mind. The day I stop learning is the day I stop improving, and I'm just going to get worse. So I'm always open to seeing what other strength coaches are doing. And like you said, there's a ton of great content out there. I would say that's the minority.
Do you feel like Ben Patrick has had a net negative on the health of the kinesiology of modern culture? And their knees specifically, which is the main focus?
Yeah, no, definitely not. Because again, if you look at kind of the different elements of that, like we said, the slow eccentrics, the isometrics, the tibialis emphasis of the shins, which I've been a huge fan of for a long time.
That.
I think you get a ton of benefit. Every athlete, every human for that matter, get benefit from that. Working the hip flexors, which I think is underutilized a lot. Loading the hamstrings. A lot of foot and ankle activation work, which he
love
does.
The metabolite training with the sled, like literally just conditioning that extension of the knee.
Exactly. So those are all like huge, benefits to the industry. And I honestly I've always been a big fan of shin work, hip flexors, Nordic hamstrings to an extent. I learned from Ben. I'm like, man, I'm going to start doing even more of this. And I put it online like, hey, Ben Patrick does some great stuff. We disagree on what constitutes his optimal range of motion. But he's doing some amazing things that I've learned from that I personally have implemented.
So your beef largely is the bilateral squat position over a lunge position. So if a person, because a lot of Ben stuff is, I don't know what his exact prescription is, but some percentage of body weight going into that deep knees over toes lunge position, which would seem to kind of go against a lot of what I would think it would go against a lot of your philosophies. But how do you feel from the lens of a lunge?
Yeah, it's just going to open up another can of worms here, but I'm not a fan of that movement either. But I personally don't. I would kind of put that in the same category as the squat. Again, I think a lot of what Ben does is great. I don't personally like that exercise. So just getting a little bit into some of the science of the stretching under those conditions and those positions. When you overstretch a muscle, one of the responses is that it comes back tighter and it comes back with a vengeance. It's a protective mechanism in our bodies. It's basically the stretch reflex, but there's various forms of that. And it's there to protect us so that we don't come back and overstretch in the future. That's why a lot of people that do stretching, well, what's the thing that they feel compelled to do about 30 minutes later? Stretch again because the muscles came back tighter. Feels good for 10, 15, 20 minutes, maybe even 30 minutes. But at some point, whether it's 30 minutes later, a few hours later, it's going to come back tighter. Then they're going to have to stretch it again.
You can change the constitution. You can change the constitution of the sarcomeres and the myofibrils and the actual, like the physical structural composition. Sarcomerogenesis does manifest as a product of ongoing stress. Suddenly, your muscle fibers say, "Holy shit, this guy! We need more sarcomere. Like we need more length."
Right.
And that's why it's problematic to say like wear high heels all the time. Like you can actually change the constitution of your ankles and your hips.
Oh yeah, no, you can slightly alter the length tension relationship of the muscles left or right. Now it's pretty small to the point that like, okay, somebody instead of their optimal biomechanical leverage being at 90 degrees, for example, at like if they're holding like a bicep curl, it might change it to like 92, 93 degrees. It's not like all of a sudden they're going to go to like, oh man, this guy's been training extreme range of motion, so now his biomechanical optimal is like 130 degrees. That's not going to happen. So it can change it a little bit. But the biggest thing when it comes to the strength curve, if we want to really change it, is we got to elevate it. We just got to gain more strength, right? I mean, that's the biggest thing. And so it's not like we're going to change the shape of it that much. We're not going to change it to the left or right a whole lot. There's some research to show that long eccentric long positions can shift it a little bit to the right. But if we can elevate that strength curve and gain strength, that's how we're going to be able to handle more loads, more force in all positions, not just 90 or not just at short positions or long. Because again, that inverted U, that length tension relationship, it's the same for all humans.
What else you got, Zach? You said you got.
So here's my proposition, Joe. Joe, the evil twin.
Yeah.
So here's my proposition, Joel. I would like to do 4 weeks of 90-degree eccentric isometrics. If you will do 4 weeks of ATG with eccentric, with isometric, but I like to call them resting pauses. And we can determine whether it is 8 workouts or 12 workouts. So 2 times a week squatting or 3 times a week squatting. 20 minutes per session, maybe more, 20 to 30, maybe 40 minutes per session. You do it, you do the ATG, and I'll do that. Again, this is not something, you don't have to implement this with anyone else. This is just you and me.
Yeah. So
would you be interested in this?
Yeah, no.
I will program for you.
Okay.
You will program for me.
Who programs for me? I got to be involved in this. Should I do
Aaron, I think you should do both. You should do both.
Ah, good. Very good.
Actually, it would be nice if I could do it with a partner. That'd be great.
All right. Yeah. The small caveats in there, I can tell you just from previous experience of when I had big injuries, if I start doing heavy ass to grass barbell squats, it's going to start messing with my back. So
you have to trust that I'm going to load you properly. You said the word heavy. I did not say the word heavy.
All right.
This is simply the modality of the ATG squat.
Okay.
The load is something completely different.
Okay.
So I'm not going to overload you. I'm going to bring you in nice and easy.
Okay.
And then you and I will meet up at the end of this and we will have a chat.
Awesome. All right.
Really? You'll do that, Joel?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yes.
I love that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't want to go below parallel.
Okay.
So,
all right.
And I know you don't have a problem with that. So I want to do 90-degree eccentric isometrics. I want to see how I feel at the end of 8 workouts over the course of 4 weeks. I want you to do ATG squats over the course of 4 weeks, 8 workouts, and then Aaron's going to hop in with me. What a fun exercise.
This is cool. This feels like progress.
Yeah,
not towards anyone being right or wrong, but just people connecting. I'm a hippie.
Yeah, that's
a problem.
Very cool.
I get it. I love love.
All right.
I like it. Awesome.